Yeah, just checking everything is okay over here. You are live. Okay, it says I'm live. Let's see. Yeah, perfect. So we are live on YouTube, my friends. Okay, so here we are. Wow. What a lovely day again today. And today is 15th of February, right? Yeah, it's 15th of February. It's a lovely day. Yesterday was Valentine's Day. I was just playing with my Excel workbooks, which I love a lot. And today I'm here with one of my friends from the community who is going to talk about Lambda. I'm quickly going to introduce to him about him to you. But as usual, I'll just quickly start the meetup. Welcome to Microsoft Excel Power Platform Meetup for Saudi Arabia, where we want to meet, connect, learn together. And it's a one place with infinite solutions with all of our friends. We are coming over here and we are talking about Excel. And note that, my friends, that this session is getting live streamed and recorded and will be available on youtube.com/Excel Exciting in the playlist of all the meetups. So just quickly about myself, I'm Faraz Shaikh, founder of excelexciting.com, and I'm an MVP, MCV, MIE, Office Master. You know, most of you know that I'm a YouTuber and blogger, and I run this lovely meetup with all of you guys. And my always a mission with my friends and to give exciting solutions. And today I'm here with one of my great friend over here with Lambda Solutions. He's having some awesome Lambda because I'm really impressed when I see his solutions. So surprise will get open soon because I'm quickly going to announce his name also, the guest today. And my passion with my friends is to share and gain the knowledge. Of course, we are all here to share our knowledge, to gain it. And it's really awesome. So these are some of our past meetups. If you haven't got a chance to see them, make sure that you go and check this meetup. And in fact, we did a summit last year. It was My Data Summit 2022 with my friend Elgar. And we have hosted around like back-to-back massive mega, around 33 sessions. And all the audience were joining from the globe, more than 300 participants were there. So that was super awesome. And you can check that all the other recordings which are available on the YouTube, you can always go and check that. And you can see the QR code and you can scan them. So Pragati was our first speaker of the meetup. And then now today we have the special guest, Owen Price. Owen is over here. But let me tell you about some of our upcoming events, which is on 15th of March by Georgia. He will be explaining about introduction to measure killer. So this is something interesting with his tool. He'll be explaining about with Power BI, the measure killer, how it would be. And then we have in April with David, my friend from Sweden, who is already all here on the call with us right now in this meetup. He'll be talking about the lesser known parts of Excel. So we were having a chat before the meetup. So he told me about some exciting Excel unknown features, unknown things which you are not aware. So make sure that you go and subscribe to these meetups. In fact, David one will be announced within a couple of days, within 1 or 2 days, we'll be announcing it. So you can always feel free to join this with this URL and you can scan the QR code. And as always, I always invite my friends from the community, please feel free to write back to me if you have any kind of a knowledge you would like to share about Microsoft or Power Platform, Azure, anything, just write it back and we can connect and you're here, you can share your superhero skills with the community. And just quick to have an best experience, you all must be knowing now, just to make sure that you can keep your mic mute. And if you have any questions, we'll be inshallah having time at the end of the session or during the session. I'll leave it to open that how you would like to take the Q&As. So here is our guest today, Owen Price, and he will be talking about Lambda, robustness and reusability. Lovely, Owen. So, Owen, I've been following him since I met him on Celia Meetup, and I've been knowing him from Celia Meetup, and since that time, I've been following his posts, and he really makes some cool stuff on Lambda with this new function scan. And I'll leave the floor for our guest today, Owen, and he can just tell us about himself more. And stage is yours, Owen.
Okay, great. So I'm Owen. I'm going to be talking about Lambda today. I've been working with Excel since probably 1999, the first time I used it. Back then, that was before the ribbon was introduced, and we used to use the file menus. And I first used a pivot table in 2000, I think. And since then, I've just kind of used it in whatever job I've been in to quickly solve problems where we didn't have development resource, or I didn't have the patience to wait for the development resource. I would put things together myself just out of curiosity and kind of just poking around and seeing what can be done. And that's really how I learn. And when Lambda became available to me, I kind of dove into it and tried to learn as much as I could and see what I could do with it. And that's kind of brought me here, I guess. And I'm going to talk about robustness and reusability. Actually, the beginning of the presentation will not be focusing on Excel at all, but you'll see why in a moment. And then things will get progressively more in depth as we progress. And then at the end, we'll all be very confused, including myself. Okay, so shall I just start now? Yeah?
Yeah, sure. Please go ahead.
All right. Okay, so Lambda, robustness and reusability. As I mentioned, I am going to be starting outside of Excel. And the first thing I want to talk about is, in terms of reusability and also robustness, is gists. If you are not using gists, don't worry about it. I wasn't using gists for a long time, but gists are a great way to share your work with others. They're also a great way to keep track of what you're doing, not just with Lambda, but with anything really. It's kind of like a mini repository, and it's a free service on github.com. And so let's look at gists. So to get to a gist, to create a gist account, you will go to gist.github.com. You can sign in or sign up for a GitHub account. It's free, and you can then instantly start sharing code with others. It's really very, very, very simple and very, very useful. So to create a gist, you sign in to gist.github.com. You click the plus in the top right-hand corner. You then enter a description. I tend to use text along the lines of, this Lambda function does, and then a description of what it does. And then you add a file name, including extension. Now, there are different schools of thought as to what you would use for the extension or the file name, but generally, recently I've settled on these two formats, and I use Excel-Lambda-function if it's a single function, and then the name of the function, .txt. And then if it's a module, which used to be called namespaces, I use Excel-Lambda-module-name of the module.txt. And the reason I do that is that it makes it easier to search for them later, and it helps me stay organized. So you enter a file name, you paste the definition of your functions in the main box, and then you select whether you want to create a secret gist or a public gist. Now, one thing I will just mention is that a secret gist is not a private gist. So you can create a secret gist, and that keeps it hidden from search, and you can't find it with Google, and you can't find it in the search in github.com. But if you give the URL to somebody, they can access it without any credentials, and they can give it to anybody else. And basically anyone with the URL of a secret gist can access the code in that gist. So secret is not private. And public is the same, except it's accessible through Google search, through just GitHub search, and so on. So generally, if I'm happy with what I've done, I'll make a public gist. And if I'm kind of working on something or it's not really relevant to many people, I'll make a secret gist and just share the link with people. So I just want to show you a quick demo of that in case you've never done it before. I'm just going to do it quickly. So I use dark mode in most of my applications. You will hopefully get used to it before the end of the call. But I've gone to gist.github.com. I'm signed in with my profile. And by default, you see this here. So what I'm going to do is say this Lambda function, and I'm going to create an example, very simple example, adds two numbers together. And I'm going to put Excel Lambda function add.txt. And then the function is, you might guess, super simple, A plus B. Okay, and then we put a semicolon at the end. If you're in a locale that uses a semicolon as the list separator instead of the comma, then you need to put two semicolons to separate functions from one another in the gist. So you can create that, and if I hit create secret gist now or create public gist, it will create it with a single file. So let me do that, create secret gist. So that's created a gist. And then how do I get rid of this bar at the top here? Oh, it doesn't matter. And then this URL, I can give that to anybody and they'll be able to use this function. But I want to show you a few other things you can do here. So you can add other files. Why you shouldn't do this will become clear in a moment. So you can add a Lambda function for subtract as well, which is basically the same thing. Oops. Subtract. And then you update, and now your gist has two files in it. Okay. So that's actually the end of that very brief demo. I'll come back to this in a moment once I've spoken through the next slides. So the next thing is to actually use it, use a gist. What do you do with it? You copy the URL, you open the advanced formula environment, and you go to the modules tab, usually, and you hit this button that looks like a cloud with an arrow. And that actually, the tooltip for that says import from URL in English. And then you see this dialog come up and you paste the gist URL into that box. If you don't select this tick box, it will import the code from the gist into whatever module you have selected when you hit that button. So workbook is a module. If I have that selected and I hit the button and I don't select this tick box, whatever's in the gist will be imported into the workbook module. Otherwise, if I click the tick box, it will ask me for a name, or I can click new and then select the new one that I've created and then press import, and it will import to the new module. And so I should just show you that very quickly. So I'm going to copy the URL, go to Excel, which is this one, and open the advanced formula environment, which is Alt-MY. I've got a couple of modules here already, just ignore those for now. So if I create a new one, and let's just call it test gist, and then I hit import and paste the URL, note what's happened. So what's happened and what hasn't happened. It's imported the first file in the gist, but it hasn't imported the second file. So I don't know whether that's deliberate on the part of the developers, but it's not what I expected anyway. So my advice to you, first piece of advice of the day, is only use a single file in a gist if you're using it to share Lambda functions, because everything after the first file will not be imported when you share that with somebody else. So it's added that function into the module that was selected when I added it. And just to show you what it does when you do that, I'm going to call my new module another test. And so it creates a new module at the same time as importing the first file from the gist. Okay, so let's delete that and delete the test as well. Okay, the other thing I wanted to show you in this demo, before I delete the test, is conflict. So if I try to import that gist again into the existing module, you can see that it's added it. It's added the first file, the first function again, but it's conflicting with an existing name. So you've got this error line here. So the advanced formula environment, it's smart, but it's not that smart. So it's not trying to resolve any conflicts here. It's not giving you a message saying you've already got a function called add in that module. I'm not going to import it, or I'm going to import it with an underscore and a 2 at the end, or any number of ways that it could differentiate them. It doesn't do that. So you just need to be conscious of that. And when you try to click save, when you've got an error in any of your modules, if you try to click save and push the names into the name manager, it won't work for any of them if there are any errors in any module. And you can see wherever you've got errors in the advanced formula environment, there's a red marker on the right hand side, and you've got a red line under there, and you can view the problem. This is duplicate identifier, so beware of that. And then the other thing, which I tried, which didn't work, but I'll show you anyway, is that importing a gist relies on a specifically formatted URL. So it needs to be HTTPS and so on, gist github.com, a username, and then it needs to be this 32-character hash. If it's anything else, it won't work, which is a shame, because what I really wanted to do was hit raw here, which gives me the raw contents of this subtract lambda, and I wanted to copy this URL of that lambda and then try to import it like that. But it says the supplied URL is malformed or not supported. So that doesn't work, basically. And it won't even let me import it. In a moment, I will show you that I created an open feedback report on the Excel forum today to change this behavior. But we'll see about that in a minute. So that is the demo for using a gist. It's very quick, I hope. So the takeaways here for gists is my recommendation is you use a consistent file naming convention. The one that I showed you is just what I do. And you should only use one file in each gist, and secret does not mean private. Okay. And then this is what I was speaking about just a moment ago. If you go to the Excel feedback forum, you will see that I've submitted a request. This is me, OP. I've submitted this request to allow importing of text file contents from other URLs, multi-file gists, and local text files. The reason for that last one will become clear in a moment. There was one more thing that I was going to show you about that. I've forgotten what it was. It'll come to me in a moment. Okay. Before we move on, let's talk about Git. Now, I only realized this maybe 2 or 3 days ago, which is a bit embarrassing, but I only realized this, that a gist is a Git repository, and it behaves and can be used in the same way as a Git repository. If you're not familiar with Git, don't worry too much. I'm going to do a little demonstration, but GitHub is a way of managing Git repositories, and Git is a version control technology, and a gist is a Git repository, and you can manage it in the same way. Now, the cool thing about this is that it means you can synchronize your gists with your local computer. You can edit the files on your computer and push the changes back into the gist in the same way that you would with any other code in any other version control software. So the way to do that is on your gist page, there is this there's this drop down. When you first see it, it says embed, and you need to select clone via HTTPS. You need to copy the repository URL, and the repository URL for a GitHub repository ends it with the .git extension. And then there are many ways to manage Git repositories. I use Git bash. There are other ways which other people may prefer, but I use git bash, and that's what I'm going to show you in a moment. But essentially, you can open a repository on your local computer by using the git clone command with the URL that you copied. And what that will do is it will create a folder in the folder that you activated that git clone command, which is named after the 32-character super easy to remember and read gist URL suffix. As you can see here, for these slides, I repeated what I'm about to show you, which is how to clone a gist to your computer. So without further ado, let me go to File Explorer, and I've created this folder in my local disk called gist repositories. Now with git bash, one of the reasons I like it is that I can right click and git bash here, and I've increased the font size in this just to make it a bit easier to see. So I've got my git bash terminal from where I'm going to enter commands. This is the gist that I just created. It's got the add function and the subtract function, 2 files. Here's the embed menu. I'm going to select clone via HTTPS, and then I'm going to copy the repository address. And then I'm going to return to File Explorer and git bash. And I'm going to type git in lowercase, git clone, and then the repository URL. Okay, so what that has done in File Explorer is it has downloaded the gist into this folder, and this folder is the suffix of the URL. And inside is a hidden folder called .git, which you get in every local Git repository, and the files in the gist. And these files, I can now edit them in whatever way I choose on my local computer, and then save them in here, and then I'll be able to push the changes back to the gist. And the way that we can do that is quite simple. So I use Notepad++ for text editing, and what I'm going to do here is just add some metadata, description, let's say description adds to numbers, and parameters, A is a number, and B is also a number. Okay, so I've edited that file in a very simple way. Now, in git bash, what I can do now is say git add period, and that command identifies any changes that have been made to the files in the repository. Oh, I'm in the wrong folder. Excuse me. I did that when I was setting this up as well. I was sure I wasn't going to do it, but I did anyway. So let's try CD. Oh, shift insert. Okay, now I can do it. Git add period. So that's added, and I can check which files have been changed, added, removed, and so on with git status. And you can see that it's modified Excel Lambda function add.txt. And to commit my changes, I do git commit m and then message. So I added metadata for the add file. So that's now committed that change. The last thing to do is then just push the change back to the gist. And to do that, we do git push origin master and wait a second. And then that has now pushed the change that I made back to the URL. So if I refresh this now, if all goes well, you can see that the metadata has been added to the add file. And now, because I've done that in kind of a semi-automated way, anyone else who wants to come along and clone this repository can do so. Okay, so hopefully that all makes sense. That's using Git to manage gists. But remember, when you use the advanced formula environment, it will only import the first file. So having 2 files like this is generally not a good idea, unless you want to do a lot of copy and pasting. Okay. So I've put a table, I'm going to share these slides with you later. I've put a table in here that has the Git commands that you need to do what I just did. I tend to forget these if I don't use Git for several months. I just forget all of this, and and actually this table is going to be quite helpful to me. And the takeaways for that is you can clone a gist to your local computer, make edits locally, and then push the changes to the URL. And this is a QR code to the download for Git Bash, and the web address for that I think is gitforwindows.com or something like that. Okay, so before I move on, does anybody have any questions about gists or Git or anything like that?
There is a question in the chat, Owen, can you change the public to secret after the state of creation?
No, I don't think you can. You can change visibility. Yeah, I think I was reading the other day that you can change it in one direction but not the other.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think you can change from public to secret, but you can change from secret to public.
Okay.
So yeah, thanks. I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat, but I appreciate the extra info from Ali and Eric.
Yeah.
There's also, if you actually, just on that point about the advanced formula environment, if you've not done this yet, you might want to do this, which is you open the advanced formula environment and then come to feedback here. Okay. Invitation to complete research survey on Excel Lambda. You can click this link here and it'll take you to a Microsoft form where you can fill in your experiences with the advanced formula environment and what you use it for and what you would like to see changed and that kind of thing. So I did that myself a couple of days ago. And I think that the submissions go directly to Jack Williams, who's the main developer on the add-in. So that's another option. Okay. You want me to try to edit the gist? So edit the gist. And I can update it. Oh, I can't change it to... Oh, I can make public with this button. Let me make it public and see if I can change it back. So that's now public. And then if I edit, I can update public, but there's no button for make secret. So to summarize, if you create it as secret, you can change it to public. But if you create it as public, you can't change it to secret. You would have to delete it and start over. Okay.
There is a question like, basically we use just to store our lambdas, what we create in Excel. That is a major use of just, but apart from storing lambda, it is also used to store codes and other VBA codes and some...
Yeah, any code that you want to share with somebody. So actually, yeah.
Some people are very new to the gist.
Yeah, so, sure. I mean, it's very easy. You just create a GitHub account and you come to this address and you click the plus and you get started. And actually, I found the other day that you can, it doesn't have to be text. You can add Excel files to gist. You can add images to gist. You can add all kinds of things. Okay, just be careful. If you try to import a gist with an Excel file as in there, it will import a hash of the contents of the Excel file. And it'll look a complete mess and you won't know what's happening. So just don't do that. Learn from my mistake. So another thing that I do with gist is I create Power Query. I share Power Query functions in there. So here's a date list one that I shared the other day. I think I've got some SQL ones somewhere in here as well. There's, the Excel BI challenges on LinkedIn. I put my answers to those in here. And that's why I've got, I don't know, 111 gists created in the last 12 months. So anyway, for Lambda, the reason that I suggest using this function, this format, is because the search makes it easy. So if I go file name Excel Lambda and then user ncalm, which is mine, this now has given me the 45 gists that are Lambda functions or Lambda modules. So actually the search is not that good on GitHub, in my opinion. And I found that using the file name and the user is a safe way to get to what you want to get to. So that's why I recommend the Excel Lambda prefix. I believe Eric likes to put .lambda as a file extension as well, which is just as good, probably better, in fact. But this is the way I do it. Yeah, you can add Excel files as just be careful, because when you try to import them, it just doesn't go well. Okay, let's go back to the slides. We've been 30 minutes already. I didn't mean to take that long on this part. Okay, so you can download Git Bash. There are many other ways to interact with GitHub. I use Git Bash because I learned it when I was doing the Coursera course like 10 years ago. So there are many ways to do it. Okay, so let's talk about function names. First of all, let's talk about native functions. And by native functions, I mean the functions that we use every day, some products, XLOOKUP, all of that stuff. Those are native functions. That's what I mean when I say native functions. And as for function names, and the reason I'm talking about this in this presentation is we are talking about reusability, which means sharing, and with sharing, we need an element of predictability. Or we need to know what to expect when someone has shared something with us or when we are sharing something with someone else. That's why I use the file prefix. And that's why I'm talking about function names. And I'll get to my recommendation for function names in a moment. Again, it's a recommendation. You may not like it, but you might. So native functions are capitalized. They have no punctuation in them except for a period in some functions. Names of functions do not conflict with references. So you don't have a function called A1 or any combination of column letter and row number. There are no such functions. They're usually pretty descriptive. They're usually quite short. Other things, they don't have underscores in them. They're not camel cased. No, corollaries of everything that I've said here, but they're not perfect either. So if you're familiar with these three functions, I've always just thought these are just not very well named at all. Sum x2 my2, which is the sum of squares along a straight line or something like that. Two corresponding ranges, there you go. So to me, that's not well named. Why do I mention this now? It's not to be mean to the Excel developers. It's just to say that don't stress too much about the function names that you create, because even the people who build the product are not perfect. So create something that's descriptive and short, but don't stress too much about it. So those are the native functions. And as for Lambda functions, there are some rules. Lambda function names must follow the same syntax rules as Excel names, any other Excel name that you put in the name manager. So the first character must be a letter or an underscore or a backslash. You can see on line 3, 4, and 5, these are valid Lambda function names with a backslash. That was surprising to me. But these are valid names. The remainder of the characters in the name must be letters, numbers, periods, or underscores. So you can't begin a function with a number, a period, or any other punctuation, but you can put a period inside a function name. You can put a number inside a function name, and you can put an underscore inside a function name. You can't put a backslash inside a function name, but you can put it at the beginning. You can't use C or R because these are commonly used shorthands for columns and rows. You can't use references. They will not work. You can't have spaces, and names are not resolved in a case-sensitive way. So you can't differentiate two names by having them differently cased. So if I put a function called count and ignore the definition of the function, I can't count capitalized. I can't then have the same word, but with different casing in the same module. It will say there's a duplicate identifier. So those are the rules for naming Lambda functions. And I want to show you two things. First of all, duplication of native functions doesn't work. And some reasons why we might group like functions using a period. So let's go back to Excel and go here. So in my workbook module, which has got a lot of mess in it, I have created this sum function. Let's see if I can, that's not zooming. It's Control Plus, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. So this is my duplicate implementation of sum, where I've used reduce in a very stupid way to sum the array and the data in array. And this is in the workbook module, so it's not in a named module, which means it doesn't have a function prefix. Now, this is already saved, and look what happens if I type sum. You can see that there are two of them here. Yeah. The first one says adds all the numbers in a range of cells. That's the native function. The second one doesn't say anything because that's my Lambda function. So let's say I want to use my Lambda function. If I type the open paren, it resolves to using the native function. So I actually can't use my defined function from line 53 because it won't let me. If I type sum and open paren, it gives me the tooltip for the native sum. So you can't do that, it doesn't work. And I thought to myself, okay, well, I can't do it by typing, but maybe I can do it with use in formula, which is, of course, this handy feature that I never use. And here's my Lambda function here. I've entered it, and then an open paren gives me the tooltip for the native function. So duplicating existing function names, not only being a bad idea generally, doesn't work. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is grouping like functions using a period. So in a moment, I'll be showing you what these functions do. But you can see that they're in the workbook module, but I've separated two words in these function names using a period. And the main reason to do that is that in my workbook module, I've got a lot of junk which I created for this presentation, but I've also created these functions which I want to be found easily by just typing add and period. And then now in my selection of functions are all the functions that begin with add period. So of course you can do that without a period. You can do it with any character, really. It's just a period is a useful way to separate them. So that's one thing, but do not mistake this with the period and the prefix that you get by using a module, because it's not the same thing. So this is a function name, add.alt, add.if omitted, and so on. And the functions in the demo module are accessed in the same way, but they're completely separate. So I do actually have a sum function in the demo module. And this is a completely different function to the native sum function. And it works because it's in a different module. Because it is in a named module, it works. If you tried to put it in the workbook module, it wouldn't work. Okay. Back to the presentation. So this is my recommendation. It's probably quite controversial. I know a lot of people out there like Pascal case. Some people like camel case. I like Excel Lambda functions to be capitalized because the paradigm in Excel is that function names are capitalized. If you're creating a big Lambda function with a lot of lines in it, it is useful to be able to differentiate a function name from a let variable and a let variable from a parameter / argument value. And the quick way to differentiate a function name is to use the already established paradigm, which is that a function name is capitalized. And that's what I do most of the time. Sometimes I forget. And my recommendation is start with a letter, use numbers sparingly, only use periods to group like functions, don't use underscores, and make them meaningful. I'm seeing typing coming out in the chat over there. Yeah, I agree with David. We should be glad you can't override existing function names. So this is my suggestion, my recommendation, take it or leave it. But my reasoning is that when you're looking at a lot of code, if it's all capitalized, it's a function. And it's as simple as that. Okay, so let's move on to modules. Modules used to be called namespaces. I then had to rename a lot of things because it changed. I've already kind of touched on this. Why would we use them? So it's so that we can avoid using confusing lambdas with native functions. I tend to put everything in modules these days, with the exception of the ones that I just showed you, because I was creating those only for the purposes of creating slides. We can keep separate functions with the same name but different domains. So, for example, as number 4 says, we can keep test functions separate from development. So let's say I'm creating an advanced filter Lambda function. I would have my lam module, which contains all of the kind of reusable functions that I've created over the last 12 months. And I would have an advanced filter in there, which is working, and I know it's working. And when I want to change it, when I want to upgrade it, I would import that lam name module into a file, and I would import it into a new take that function and put it into a test module so that it says test.advanced filter. And in that way, I can make as many changes to it as I want, improve the performance, change the parameter checking and all those kinds of things, and eventually compare the output of one to another without having to do a lot of copying and pasting. So this is an important benefit, I think. If you get into this kind of somewhat complicated development, then keeping things separated is very useful. And also keeping functions from other developers separate. So, you don't know me. You don't know whether I can be trusted and whether all the work that I produce is great. Actually, it's not. So if you import a gist from my GitHub gist account, I recommend you import it into a separate module so that you can at least figure out what it does for yourself before you unleash it on other functions. And then the last one, which is actually my favorite, is that it's easier to find when typing formulas. So I can just type lam dot and then all my functions are there. Okay. Before I move on to parameters, any questions about these last few sections? No?
No, I think we can carry on.
Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to talk about parameters. This is on the theme of robustness. Optional parameters we've all created. I'm sure everybody in the call has probably created a Lambda function, and most of you have probably used an optional parameter. You know that it's enclosed in square brackets when you put it in the parameter list. You know that a user can omit the parameter when they're using the function, and you know about is omitted. And you should know that it's then therefore up to you to control what happens when someone gives you a value for that parameter and when someone doesn't give you a value for that parameter. And so I've got a very quick demo just to remind you or to show anybody who has not done this yet some of the things to think about. So this is why I've got these functions in this workbook module. Okay, so add simple is the first one I'm going to look at. It's very simple. It's literally adding A and B. So let's say 1 and 2. So that gives us 3, right? Easy. So both A and B are required parameters. Neither of them are enclosed in square brackets. So the first thing I want to show you is that if I omit the second parameter or either of the parameters, it won't allow me to do any tests for that. It will in fact just give me a value error. And that's if I omit 1 or 2 or both, A or B or both. And that you just get a value error. It just doesn't work because it's expecting 2 things and you've only given it 1. Now you might be forgiven for thinking that if you okay, well, let's say someone misses out on a required parameter, they missed B. You might be forgiven for thinking that you can just test if B has been omitted or not, and everything will be okay. And in the case of B being omitted, you default B to 0, so the result is A instead of A plus B. But actually, if it's a required parameter and you omit one of them, it doesn't matter if you've got that if is omitted test in there, it still gives you a value error because it's a required parameter and it doesn't even get as far as the calculation of the lambda. Now it's different for optional parameters, as you are probably aware. So you can omit optional parameters safely, and it has defaulted, you can see on line 39 here, it has defaulted to a return value of A instead of A plus B, because I've used if is omitted on B, and B is an optional parameter. So this pattern of if is omitted, some value and then some other value, is so common, and I'm sure that everybody is sympathetic. It's so common that I created an if omitted function. I also created a Microsoft Excel feedback item, which I'm going to ask you to vote on if you want to implement this as a native function. But essentially, I've got this function here where it's got an argument, a then part, and an else part. If the else part is omitted, then use the argument, otherwise use the else part in a let variable called _else. Okay. And then if the argument is omitted, an argument has been passed from another function, if is omitted on that argument returns true, return the then part, otherwise return this _else. And the reason for doing that is because sometimes with if omitted, you want to do something else with the else part. You don't want to just return B. So the way this works, add.if omitted, is I just put 1 in there. So that's the same function. It's just that it's used this if omitted lambda to test, first of all, if B has been omitted. And if it has, we'll return A, and otherwise we'll return A plus B. And this syntax here is just another way of saying the same thing. Yeah, if omitted should be built in. I agree, Eric. Okay, so that's if omitted. And then one situation that I ran into when I was developing a couple of things was I wanted to create a function where there are 2 optional parameters and you must provide one of them. It could be one or the other. It can't be both, and it can't be neither. And the way that I did that is similar to what I've done here. So add.alt, where I've got optional A and optional B. And what I've said here is if the sum of is omitted on both optional parameters is not equal to 1, i.e. it's either 2 or 0, then return a value error. Otherwise, use a default value of 0 for each parameter and add them together. So, I mean, this is just one example of how you can have a kind of semi-required optional parameter is by using this pattern here, which is saying that if the sum of them is not equal to 1, then return an error. Otherwise, use if omitted on both. And you can see that how that works. So add.alt, and let's say 1, that's omitted and that's provided. So that becomes that. And then add.alt, and that's provided and that's omitted. And then add.alt, if they're both omitted, that's an error. And then add.alt, if they're both provided, that's also an error. So it may not come up very much, but that is one way of dealing with that. And of course, you can embed actual error values in your functions to control the type of error that is returned to the spreadsheet or to the calling function. And that's quite important. Okay. that was quite verbose. That's optional parameters. And then the next thing, which is perhaps the least paid attention to topic in developing Lambda functions because it's super boring and adds a lot of unnecessary code, is checking the type of parameters and potentially the domain of the parameter as well. So usually you'll expect a specific data type. You might expect a number or a text, and if someone gives you a text instead of a number, you'll get an error, but it won't be a very meaningful error. Similarly, the parameter may expect a limited domain of values. You might expect a number, but not only that, a number that's between 1 and 5. And if someone provides an A, it should be a meaningful error message, or if they provide a 6, it should be a meaningful error message. And unexpected values may produce confusing results, which is just repeating the same thing. And therefore, it's up to us to control what to do in both of those cases. And there's a very quick demo on that as well. Parameter types and domains. So I've got this add one function in the simple version. You can see here on line 55, which is just adding 1 to a number. And if I give it some text, that's the error message that it gives me. Okay, that's pretty standard for Excel. You get a value error message if there's something wrong with the parameter in some way. Now you can be a bit more controlled when you're creating Lambda functions. So you can do use this add1.type function, which is on line 57 in the formula environment there. And you can see that I've got if not is number, the parameter, then return this text, otherwise add them together. So let me put the text in there, and then it gives me the meaningful error message. I will just add that while this is kind of a neat way of returning messages to the spreadsheet, it's not necessarily a useful thing if the function that you're creating is going to be consumed primarily by other functions. If that's the case, then it's better to have an error code than an error message, because if you start putting custom error messages in there, you can get yourself tied in knots very quickly. So similarly, we can use for this range, add1.range, if it's between 1 and 10, I think I've put on this function. You can see on line 61 down to 67. Let's put 5. Let's added 1 to that, and then add1.range. And if I put 11, okay, so now it's given me a message. So this is not rocket science, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this kind of thing already. But the important thing is don't forget it. I frequently forget to do this kind of thing, and I wish I didn't, but I need to pay more attention to it. And some of these, particularly some of these patterns here, can be extracted into their own value check lambdas, let's say. And we might even create a function with a parameter that we expect to be a certain type, and a second parameter, which is the type check function. And the type check function may be just indicated by this and returns a true or a false based on whatever's in that parameter. I'm not going to get into that right now, but hopefully you see what I mean. So that is types and domains. Let's move on. Okay, so the takeaway about parameters is that non-optional params will cause a value error if they're omitted. And it doesn't matter if you've got type is omitted checks inside the function. If it's a required parameter, you'll get a value error. You should use if omitted for optional parameters. You can use the pattern of if open paren is omitted, or you can use the if omitted lambda function, which is available in this QR code link here. And if you go to the Excel feedback forum, you'll see that there's a feedback from me on that particular topic. So try to remember to test for the correct types, and try to remember to test for domains of those types if it's applicable. Okay, now we've got through all the boring stuff. Now we can get to the interesting stuff, which you'll be glad to hear. But before we do that, let me read the question here. What do I think about lambdas returning errors your question, Ali, Ali, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, is if I believe if the Lambda is intended to return a value to a spreadsheet, i.e. something visible to a person, it should be a meaningful text string. If it's intended to return a value to another function, then it should be an Excel standard error, because that way the calling function can handle the error message more easily. Does anybody have any other questions?
No,
Nope.
Mike,
Okay.
I think
Good.
things going well.
Okay.
Then
Do we still have time?
Yeah, we still have a time of another 30 minutes.
Great. That's exactly what I need.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're going to look at my described Lambda and all of the crazy ways that I have separated things to give me a leg up when I next come to doing something similar. So I'm going to look, I'm going to show you Lambda-ized native functions. I'm going to show you something called funcs, something called stacker, which I'm sure many of you have seen already, something called ag, and then finally something called describe. Actually, describe was the first Lambda function I ever wrote. I had seen this advanced formula environment, and there was an image on the web page that showed the code of this describe function written by, I think, Jack Williams. And I thought, oh, I want to do that. And so I had a go at doing it myself. Kind of hacked it together at a point where I didn't have VStack or HStack, and it was very time consuming to execute and very complicated. And since then, I've learned a lot. And a couple of weeks ago, I decided I was going to rewrite it and make it simpler and separate the pieces, and then talk about that separation in this meeting. So that's the reusability part, is we create separate pieces so that we can reuse them, and we can even share the pieces with others and see if they become useful. Okay, so let's move on. This is going to be mostly looking at code, I'm afraid. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is talk about Lambda-ized native functions. And what I mean by that is taking a very simple function like sum and converting it into a Lambda function. You can add some error checking to it if you want. I just happen to have done that. The reason I've done this is so that now this demo.sum function, this demo.sum function can now be passed as a parameter to another function. Currently, I can't pass the native sum function as a parameter itself to another function because it is not data. Whereas a Lambda function is saved as data and it's got a name and you can pass it into a function. So this is what I mean by Lambda-ized native functions. And I've got a load of them here. I've got min, max, count A, average. I've also got some that aren't available as native functions. So I've got standard error. For this one, I've created a confidence level function, and this is a curried function. And what happens here is, let me just embed it a little bit. What happens here is you pass a confidence level into the outer function, and then confidence returns this Lambda function configured with whatever value you gave to the level parameter. So you can see below that for the conf95 Lambda function, it is defined as being demo.confidence configured with a level of 0.05, and that gives me a 95% confidence level function. So conf95 is actually this, but wherever you see level, so here, it's got 0.05. So it's calling confidence.t 0.05, the sample standard deviation, and the count. And that's what conf95 does. And the reason that I do that way is so that I can then create conf90 in the same way, just by changing that level parameter. So that's a very simple example of currying a function to kind of simplify how you create other functions that are similar in nature. Same example here as with quartile. So I can now create a quartile 1 and quartile 3 function by calling the outer function of demo.quartile with a q parameter of 1, and it returns the inner function, which is then where you pass the data. I hope that makes sense to you. If it doesn't, I've got a video about this on YouTube, which you can dig out and look through, and hopefully it'll make more sense then. So that's what I mean by lambdaized native functions. So next I want to talk about funcs. And funcs is a bit of a silly thing, but it's necessary at the moment. Funcs is a function that creates an array of functions. Okay, I'll say that again. It's a function that creates an array of functions. So what we can't do in Excel is create an array of functions like that. So those are my three of my lambdaized native functions, and I want to put them in an array like that, but I can't, because that doesn't work, first of all. And further to that, let's say in here, function array, let's define it as that. It doesn't work either. Okay, this element is not allowed inside an array. Okay, so you can't put functions in array, in a typed array. So this funcs function allows you to pass up to 20 functions into this funcs function as parameters. Okay, at least one, up to 20. It then creates a similarly sized array on a 20-row array, determining which functions have been passed into the parameters. So this will be true for function 1. Then if we pass 2 functions, it will be true for 2, and false for 3, and false for everything else. I'm looking at Ali's code here. Yes. I'll have to look at that a bit closer later. I'm not understanding it at the moment. But anyway, this creates an array of 20 rows, true or false, depending on how many functions you've got. This returns the count of how many functions were passed into the function. And finally, the function array is using choose and sequence of the function count to return those parameters, those function parameters in an array. So function then becomes an array containing the functions that were passed as parameters into this function. And so the way that works then is demo.funcs, and I can put demo.sum, demo.min, demo.max, for example, and it returns an array that is the same size as the count of the functions that I passed into it. But of course it says calc because you can't have a function without parameters in a cell. You can see this, it says the error message here, you can't define a lambda in a cell, define your lambda in the name manager and try again using the name. Now that I've got this demo funcs, we can, this will become clear why I'm doing this. Let's say funcs, let the funcs equal to this array of functions, and then let's say index funcs 1. So that's now the first function in the array. And if I give it some data, like sequence 10, it will give me the sum. It will use the first function from that array of functions and apply it to that array of data, which is sequence 10. So the sum will be 55, I believe. Yeah, so that's 55. And then if I change it to the second row, it will take the minimum, which will be 1. And if I change it to the third row, it'll take the maximum, which will be 10, because that's the maximum of the data. And the third function is max. Okay, and that's why I created these lambda-ized native functions is so that they can then be passed into this funcs function, and I can then have an array of functions which I can then call by position. It's more than that as well. So I'll get to that in just a moment. So I need more time to consume what Ali's put into the chat there. I'm not grasping it at the moment. So that's this funcs function. And I actually took this from a guy called Travis Bolden, who I found on the Mr. Excel Lambda forum. His had 10 in it. I expanded it to 20. So that's what funcs does. Next is stacker. If you've seen, I hope you've seen my video about stacker. It will do it a lot more justice for you to watch the videos about stacker rather than me try to explain it here. But essentially, if you have an array of data to which you want to apply a function to each element in that array, let's say you've got a column of 10 pieces of data, and for that column, you want to apply a function, but the function returns an array. Let's say each function call that you apply to each cell in that array returns 10 rows. The output of this stacker function will apply that function to each cell in the input array and then stack all of the 10 row results together. Again, please go and watch the video that I made on YouTube about this. It will be much clearer if you do so. But essentially it uses reduce and take and so on just to automate this process. And by currying it such that the row function, which is the function that is applied to each element in the input array, and the stack function, which is either vstack or hstack, and these are lambda-ized versions of vstack and hstack, by currying it in that way, I can quickly create a vstacker, which is demo.stacker configured with the vstack function, such that this parameter becomes vstack, and then vstacker returns all of that, which is itself a curried function. And then into the vstacker, and I can give whatever row function I need to process my data. And then finally, I can pass into the third set of parentheses, I can pass the data on which I want to act. Again, it's not a great explanation. Please go ahead and watch the video. It will be much simpler. So the reason I want to show you stacker is because it's used in the describe function, but it's not actually integral. Just know that what it does is it takes some instruction and applies that instruction to all the data in an array. Okay, so the next thing to talk about is ag. And the reason I wanted ag is because in describe, I wanted a way of converting a piece of text that is the name of a function into the function itself. So I want to be able to put into, as a parameter to a function, I want to be able to put the word sum, and for the function to return the demo.sum lambda-ized native function, which behaves in the same way as the native sum function. I want to be able to put the text standard deviation into the ag function and return the demo.stdev_s function, which of course is a lambda-ized native function. Okay, and so on and so forth. And of course, these can be defined in as many different ways as we want. It doesn't need to be these simple descriptive statistics. It can be things acting on text variables. It can be anything, really, anything that returns a value. So ag, to get to the point, if such a thing is even possible, ag takes two parameters, an array of functions, which is created by funcs. Okay, I showed you that before. And an array that is the same size of the names for those functions. So in this example, demo.funcs, sum, min, and max, this function names array would be 3 text strings, sum, min, and max. And what that outer function creates is this inner lambda function into which we pass a single text string, and it uses XLOOKUP to find in the functions array the equivalent function that is represented by that function name. So I can pass the word sum in here and use XLOOKUP to return from the functions array the correct function. So this works in the same way, similar way to the aggregate function, except it's implemented with lambdas, and it's extensible to as many different user-defined functions as you want. So I've got these quartile 1, quartile 3, conf 95, and conf 90. I've got a bunch of other ones as well for text variables, but they're not included in the demo. So that's what ag does. So you can see here, I've actually got an example here. I use the demo funcs function to create an array of functions. And then I also pass in the names that I want to use for those functions during this exercise. You're writing on my screen. And I can then create a sum function using text. Okay, so I can use this definition of ag demo, pass the word sum into it, and I've now got a sum function, which I can then use exactly as I would use the sum function, which is just pass some data into it and it sums it. So if you're not familiar with curried functions, this is probably a bit confusing. I strongly recommend that you become familiar with it because it opens up all kinds of new possibilities. So that's ag. Ag is a way of using XLOOKUP to find a function, put simply. And then describe, this is actually the simpler version. My original version would describe all the variables in a table all at once, including text. It would return the most frequent text, the least frequent text, the count of unique text items, all kinds of complicated things. This version acts on a single column and has kind of standard descriptive statistics. And these are the descriptive statistics that you would otherwise use in the analysis tool pack. And that was one of my original driving reasons to create this in the first place was I don't like using the analysis tool pack to get descriptive statistics. I don't want to have to click into the add-in, open it up, use the add-in, lots of clicking. I want to be able to type a function and get the same thing. So without going into all of the detail, essentially, we have a table of data, a Boolean value indicating whether that table has a header or not, and an index, an integer, which indicates which column we want to return statistics for. We define the data as being either the entire data table or everything except the first row. The measure is, of course, the column that we're interested in. The header is either the first row or it's a sequence of column space integer. The statistics that we want to, the statistics are these. So these are the exact names that I want to use. These will go in the first column of the results. And this is the array of functions to align with those statistics. And again, this can be as short or as long as we want. We could even parameterize which functions are passed into the describe function. In fact, I probably will do that. And then the magic happens where we create this aggregator function, and we use the ag with the list of functions and the names for those functions. And that again returns this, which is a Lambda function of one parameter, which is a function name. Okay, and the default is sum. So this is a Lambda function of one parameter, and the parameter is the function name. Excuse me. And then I am creating this row function, which is going to act on each of the rows in this array. And the row function, excuse me, is the measure, is going to take the measure and the function name. And then I'm putting the row function into the stacker, and that essentially executes each of these functions one by one with each of these on the measure. It's kind of complicated. I told you at the beginning I was going to get confused, but it works. And even though I'm testing it here, essentially it uses a bunch of different pieces which can be reused in other projects to produce this described function. Now, the good thing about this is that now I have a big collection of Lambdaized native functions, which I can use elsewhere if I need to. I have this ag function, which is surprisingly useful. And of course, I have the vstacker function, which has been shown to be useful in lots of different scenarios. So this is the describe function, and it uses lots of different pieces and has enabled me to create an entire library of things that I can use in other places. So when I now come to rewrite my outlier functions or create new outlier functions, I will be able to reuse these quartiles, excuse me, because they're already available. Similarly with these confidence intervals, confidence levels, rather. Okay, that is a lot of talking. And I've realized now that I've got to the end of the presentation that I was going to have some demo data in here to show you that this describe function does actually work, but I don't have the demo data, so I can't show you. So I'm sorry about that. But we have come to the end, and that is the last slide. It just says thank you now. So has anyone got any questions? And by the way, Eric, thank you. I really appreciate your cheerleading there. It's very good. Any questions?
We don't have any questions now. I'm just checking it on YouTube as well. We have any questions? How do you export a module to a gist? Eric.
Eric, I think you know that you can't do that. You know that, don't you? Yeah, you're right. You can't export it at the moment, but I'm sure there's some enterprising individual out there who's created a very handy add-in in order to ease that process. How do you even do it manually? You have to copy and paste. You literally have to copy the code from the module and either paste it into the web browser or paste it into your locally synced repository version of the gist, which is tedious, I admit. This is part of the reason why I would very much like everybody to go to not only vote on this if omitted one, which would be very useful, but also to vote on the one that I created today when it loads, if it loads. Maybe it won't. This one. This is the new one I created today. So allow an import from any URL and from local text files. And here on number 3, I've said with an option to save changes to local file. So you're saying, oh, I mean, when it's not in a module, like if you just have a bunch of lambdas in the workbook, how do you export it to a gist? You still have to copy and paste, don't you? I mean, maybe you know better than I, but I think you still have to copy and paste because the workbook is just a module itself. It's the same as VBA in that respect.
Great, cool. So I think we don't have any questions also on the YouTube chat right now, but what we're gonna do is that we're gonna end the session on YouTube Live, but we'll still be on Zoom. And so it was a lovely session, Owen, and it was really a hardcore one. And I was really enjoying it. And I see comments, and Ali has also given great comments over there about getting there. Definitely, Ali, we can chat once we are off line from the YouTube. But my challenge, always, when first I discovered about Lambda, when I was very new to GitHub, so I really don't know. And the knowledge what you have shared about, it was very important, that how we can use gist and how we can import these lambdas and we can use them in recurring ones. And good thing that you pointed out about secret and public, it's nowhere secret. Yeah, that was
Yeah.
really nice.
Yeah.
And I really don't know that secret was like it remains secret. It's not a secret, in fact. So that is nice information which I knew today. And thank you, Owen. Thank you for sharing your lovely knowledge over here. And we'll be soon seeing you soon again in one more session, inshallah, about lambdas. Because every time I read about your lambdas, I'm really impressed.
Thank you.
Yeah, especially the scans and drop functions, which you use them, how you imagine them. It's really amazing. Great work. You're doing a great work, Owen. Thank
No,
you.
I appreciate the feedback. Thank you.
And my friends,
if
make sure that you give your feedback to Owen on the LinkedIn. Please, when you post, we'll be really happy to hear your feedback. And one last thing, before we end the session, as usual, I always ask my speaker to say some last words, and then we end the live stream from the YouTube. Anything, it could be a quote, it could be your own personal quote, anything what you would like to say to our friends and audiences over here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm driven to learn these things by just an innate curiosity. I've actually been on a career break for 9 months. I don't have any real reason for doing this. I'm not working at the moment. I'm learning because I want to learn. And a lot of what I've shown you today, you may be thinking, well, that's just way too complicated. I'm not going to do that. That's too much. You've gone too far. That's your right to think that, of course. But don't be put off from doing the complicated things because you haven't done it before. I wrote my first Lambda function in Excel less than 12 months ago. Okay. And before that, I hadn't really done any functional programming. Similarly, my exposure to Power Query began less than 12 months ago, like in earnest. And I've come a long way just because I've got an innate curiosity. Don't be put off by something that looks complex, because anyone who's even interested in this kind of thing is an intelligent person, and you can definitely figure it out and do some pretty amazing things.
Wow, lovely, Owen. Okay, my friends. So we are just signing out from the YouTube. Take care. Bye. And see you at the next session in the next month. And take care. Bye.